What if I told you that the case that nearly broke me happened after I hung up my badge? My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and for 35 years, I thought I'd seen every kind of evil this world could throw at me. Murder, robbery, kidnapping, fraud, you name it, I'd worked it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during what was supposed to be my peaceful retirement. It was supposed to be simple. Golf on Tuesdays, fishing on weekends, maybe some woodworking in the garage. My wife Sarah had it all planned out. We'd bought this little house in Millbrook, Connecticut, one of those quiet suburban towns where the biggest crime is usually someone's dog getting loose. After 3.5 decades of chasing killers through the streets of Detroit, I was ready for boring. But here's the thing about being a detective. It's not just a job, it's who you are. It gets in your blood, changes how you see the world. Every person becomes a potential suspect. Every story gets dissected for inconsistencies. Every coincidence gets questioned. You can take the detective out of the precinct, but you can't take the detective out of the man. The case that would consume the next 6 months of my life started with a simple knock on my door. It was a Tuesday morning in October, about 2 months after we'd moved in. I was having my coffee, reading the paper, when I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks, evenly spaced. Not the casual rap of a neighbor or the hurried bang of a delivery driver. These were the knocks of someone who meant business. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-40s, well-dressed, but with that hollow look in her eyes that I'd seen 1,000 times before, the look of someone carrying a weight too heavy for their shoulders. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, and she lived 3 houses down from us. What she told me next would launch me into the most perplexing case of my career. Her 15-year-old daughter, Emma, had been receiving mysterious letters. Not threatening letters, not love letters from some teenage admirer. These were different. Each letter contained detailed information about Emma's daily routine, what she wore to school, what she ate for lunch, which route she took home. But here's where it gets really strange. The letters also contained information about things that hadn't happened yet, things that would happen to Emma in the future. At first, Margaret thought it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe another student with too much time on their hands. But as the letters continued to arrive, one every 2 weeks like clockwork, their accuracy became impossible to ignore. The mysterious writer had predicted Emma's sprained ankle from soccer practice, her A- on a chemistry test she hadn't even taken yet, even the exact day she would get her braces removed. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. Trust me, that's exactly what I thought too. But Margaret Chen wasn't some attention-seeking suburban mom making up stories. She was a software engineer at a tech company in Hartford, rational, logical, and scared out of her mind. She'd gone to the local police, of course. But small-town cops aren't equipped to handle something like this. They took a report, asked a few questions, and basically told her to call them if anything really threatening happened. That's when she remembered that the retired detective from Detroit had moved in down the street. I'll be honest with you, my first instinct was to politely decline. I'd seen enough disturbed individuals in my career to know that sometimes people create elaborate fantasies to cope with stress or trauma. But something about Margaret's demeanor, the way she clutched those letters like they were made of fire, made me agree to at least take a look. The letters were typed on standard white paper, nothing fancy. No watermarks, no distinguishing characteristics. The postmarks were local, mailed from different locations around town. But it was the content that made my blood run cold. These weren't vague predictions like you'd get from a fortune teller. These were specific, detailed accounts of future events in Emma's life, written with an intimacy that suggested the writer knew her personally. I spent the next week doing what I do best, investigating. I interviewed Emma, her friends, her teachers. I mapped out her daily routines, identified potential surveillance points, analyzed the timing of the letters. The more I dug, the more disturbed I became. Everything the letters predicted was coming true with frightening accuracy. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Thursday, and unlike the others, this one contained information about me. It described my investigation in detail, who I'd interviewed, what questions I'd asked, even the notes I'd taken in my private journal. The letter ended with a single line that made my hands shake. The detective thinks he's hunting the hunter, but the hunter has been watching the detective. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the quiet suburban street, and for the first time in my career, I felt truly afraid. Not for myself, I'd faced down armed killers and survived, but for Emma, for Margaret, for the sense that something fundamentally wrong was happening in this peaceful little town. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I was at the local library researching the history of the neighborhood when I struck up a conversation with the head librarian, Mrs. Peterson. She'd lived in Millbrook her entire life, knew everyone and everything that happened in town. When I casually mentioned the Chen family, her expression changed. She told me about the previous owners of the Chen house, the Williamson family. They'd lived there for 12 years before moving suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving behind most of their belongings. The strange part? They'd had a daughter too, also 15 years old, who'd been receiving mysterious letters before they left town. This was the pattern I'd been looking for. I spent the next 2 weeks digging into the history of every house on that street. What I found was a trail of families with teenage daughters, all of whom had experienced the same phenomenon. The letters would start, continue for several months, and then the families would suddenly move away, often leaving town entirely. But who was behind it, and how were they predicting the future with such accuracy? The answer came from an unexpected source, Emma herself. She'd been thinking about the letters, she told me, and she'd noticed something. The predictions weren't about random events. They were about choices she was going to make, decisions she was planning, but hadn't shared with anyone. That's when I realized I'd been approaching this all wrong. The letter writer wasn't predicting the future. They were influencing it. Through careful observation and psychological manipulation, they were creating a situation where Emma would make the choices described in the letters. It's a technique called behavioral prediction, and it's more common than you might think. The question remained, who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to observe Emma so closely and manipulate her behavior so precisely? The answer was someone who had access to multiple teenage girls over the years, someone who understood adolescent psychology, someone who could observe their routines without raising suspicion. It was someone trusted, someone who was supposed to protect these girls, not prey on them, someone who had been in the perfect position to study their behavior patterns, learn their vulnerabilities, and use that knowledge to control them. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on looking for a stranger, an outsider, that I'd missed the obvious suspect. The person who had access to all these girls, who understood their psychology, who could predict their behavior because he'd been studying teenage girls for years. It was Thomas Brennan, the high school guidance counselor. He'd been in that position for 20 years, long enough to have counseled every girl who'd received the letters. He had access to their academic records, their personal struggles, their family situations. He knew their schedules, their friends, their fears and dreams. But proving would be another matter entirely. Brennan was well respected in the community, a pillar of the school system. He'd been named Counselor of the Year 3 times. Going after him without solid evidence would be career suicide, even for a retired detective. I needed a trap, something that would force him to reveal himself. Working with Margaret and Emma, we crafted a plan. Emma would start making subtle changes to her routine, small variations that wouldn't be noticeable to a casual observer, but would be significant to someone studying her behavior closely. Then we waited. If Brennan was our letter writer, he'd need to adjust his next letter to account for these changes. When the next letter arrived, describing Emma's modified routine with perfect accuracy, we'd have our confirmation. The plan worked better than I'd hoped. The next letter not only described Emma's new routine, but also contained details about the changes she'd made that only someone with intimate knowledge of her original patterns would notice. More importantly, it contained a crucial mistake, a reference to a conversation Emma had supposedly had with her mother about changing her routine. The problem was, the conversation had never happened. We'd made up the story about Emma and her mother discussing the routine changes and only told it to one person, Thomas Brennan, during what we described as a routine check-in about Emma's adjustment to the mysterious letters. That was our smoking gun. But I still needed physical evidence, something that would hold up in court. That's when I made a decision that probably wasn't entirely legal, but was absolutely necessary. I was going to search Brennan's house. I waited until he was at work, then used skills I'd developed over 35 years of police work to gain entry to his home. What I found in his basement office was a shrine to obsession. Dozens of files on teenage girls, photographs taken with telephoto lenses, detailed behavioral analysis charts, and a sophisticated computer setup for creating and printing the letters. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal where Brennan had documented his methods. He called it the Emma Project, and it detailed his psychological manipulation techniques with clinical precision. He'd studied each girl for months before beginning the letters, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their decision-making processes. The letters weren't just predictions, they were prescriptions. By describing specific behaviors and events, Brennan was creating a psychological framework that encouraged the girls to act in predictable ways. It was a form of mind control, and it had been working for years. I photographed everything, careful not to disturb the scene. Then I called the FBI. This wasn't just stalking or harassment. This was a sophisticated psychological manipulation scheme that had been operating across state lines for years. It required federal intervention. The arrest happened at the school during lunch period. I watched from the parking lot as FBI agents led Thomas Brennan away in handcuffs. The man who had terrorized dozens of teenage girls over the years looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his crimes. But the case didn't end there. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Brennan's activities. He'd been operating his projects not just in Millbrook, but in 3 other states where he'd previously worked. The FBI identified over 40 victims, teenage girls whose lives had been disrupted by his psychological manipulation. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution presented evidence of Brennan's elaborate surveillance network, his psychological profiles of the victims, and his detailed documentation of the manipulation techniques. The defense tried to argue that no physical harm had been done, that the letters were merely a form of unusual correspondence. But the jury saw through that argument. They understood that psychological manipulation can be just as damaging as physical assault, perhaps more so because it attacks the victim's sense of reality and free will. Brennan was convicted on multiple counts of stalking, harassment, and psychological abuse. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The case had a profound impact on me. After 35 years of dealing with traditional crimes, murders, robberies, assaults, I'd encountered something entirely new. Brennan hadn't used physical violence or threats. Instead, he'd weaponized psychology itself, turning the normal process of human decision-making into a tool of control and manipulation. It made me realize that crime is evolving, becoming more sophisticated and subtle. The criminals of the future won't just use guns and knives. They'll use psychology, technology, and our own cognitive biases against us. Law enforcement needs to evolve too, to understand these new forms of criminal behavior. But perhaps most importantly, the case reinforced something I'd always believed but had never seen demonstrated so clearly: the power of paying attention. Every detail matters. Every pattern has significance. Every coincidence should be questioned. The difference between a solved case and an unsolved one often comes down to noticing the one thing that everyone else missed. For Emma Chen and her family, the resolution brought both relief and trauma. The knowledge that their every move had been watched and analyzed for months was deeply disturbing. But they also felt vindicated. Their fears had been real, their concerns justified. They weren't crazy or paranoid. They were victims of a sophisticated predator who had almost gotten away with his crimes. The case also changed how I view retirement. Sarah had wanted me to leave the detective work behind, to focus on golf and fishing and enjoying our golden years. But this case showed me that you can't just turn off 40 years of training and instinct. The skills that made me a good detective, observation, analysis, persistence, these aren't just professional tools, they're part of who I am. So I found a new purpose in retirement. I work with local police departments as a consultant, helping them understand unusual cases that don't fit traditional patterns. I speak at conferences about psychological manipulation and cybercrime. I've even written a book about the Emma Chen case, hoping to help other law enforcement officers recognize similar patterns. The most important lesson I learned from this case is that evil isn't always obvious. It doesn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie, has a respectable job, and hides behind a facade of community service. The most dangerous criminals are often the ones who appear most trustworthy, who use their positions of authority to access and manipulate their victims. Thomas Brennan is serving his sentence at a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He's eligible for parole in 2038 when he'll be 73 years old. I hope he serves every day of that sentence, because what he did to those girls, the psychological damage, the violation of their sense of security and free will, that's something that can never be fully repaired. But I also hope his victims find peace. Emma Chen is now 21, a junior in college studying psychology. She wants to help other victims of psychological manipulation. Her mother, Margaret, has become an advocate for stronger cyberstalking laws. They've turned their trauma into purpose, and that's the most powerful form of justice I can imagine. As for me, I've learned that retirement doesn't mean the end of making a difference. It just means finding new ways to use the skills and experience you've accumulated over a lifetime. The Emma Chen case may have been the most disturbing investigation of my career, but it was also the most important. It reminded me why I became a detective in the first place, to protect people from those who would harm them, no matter how sophisticated or subtle that harm might be. The case is closed, the perpetrator is behind bars, and the victims are healing. But the lessons learned continue to resonate, reminding us all that vigilance is the price of safety, and that sometimes the most important cases are the ones that find us when we least expect them.